Proportional Response. Book 1, Chapter 18, Part 1. Opening Moves. Ohan Nindesh looked down at his blue hands, flexed the 6 fingers on each one, looked up at his small coffee shop, watched his one Venter employee dance behind the bar while challenging her human fellow employees to keep up, and smiled. He had not, since a human mercenary crew rescued him from a mixed-species crew of pirates, regretted his decision to settle on the human world they brought him to. Each day since then had brought new wonders, like the first fellow Venter to wander into his coffee shop some 2 years ago. He'd hired the woman on the spot. She'd been full of questions about the humans, and it hadn't taken long for him to figure out she was diadem intelligence. But he didn't see the harm in telling her everything he'd learned by living among his deliverers for so long. Besides, she'd been an excellent barista and seemed to have a way with the rowdier of the human men. Still, for all of her ability to handle them, she seemed so vexed sometimes by the simplest things about. Besides, I think she knows. Still, it would be nice to find out if she chose this place because she wanted to pick my brain, or because we are next door to one of their military recruitment centers. He laughed to himself as the conjecture surfaced again. Then, suddenly, every TV in his coffee shop switched to the same site, despite each being tuned to a different broadcast. The human ambassador stood in a single shaft of light, a grim expression on his face. Ohan looked around and saw that every screen he could see, from billboard signs to cell phones, seemed to be displaying the same feed. When the human spoke, his voice seemed to come from every speaker within reach. The broadcast lasted only a few minutes. When it finished, a stunned silence seemed to permeate the shop. Ohan felt his heart pound suddenly in his chest as he considered the implications of what he'd seen. His one Venter employee moved first, turning to him and quirking an eyebrow and gesturing at the coffee shop, as if to ask what it would mean for them. He looked down at the display on his computer, at the order he'd been about to place for the next week's supplies. He hit a button to multiply everything in the order by 10, then thought a moment and hit that button again. She blinked at him in surprise, her keen eyes able to see what he'd done on the screen. Then a human fist slammed down on the counter and everyone seemed to move at once. Outside, cars which had stopped to watch the broadcast began to move, and people walking by seemed to move with a new sense of purpose in their steps and grim expressions on their faces. Still, the spy woman stood there and looked at him, as if to question the size of the order he'd put in. In answer, he pointed through the windows of his shop at the line to get into the military recruitment office. It had already begun stretched down the length of the block. Jago Hoofer smoothed her feathers and knocked on the door of her human captain's private cabin. She heard Sora's voice, muffled, on the other side of the door, and settled down to wait. She brought up the human ambassador's speech, delivered a few hours ago, and watched it for what felt like the millionth time. It still brought a hard, cold smile to her face. Jago hated the Zoltan, had hated them ever since a routine inspection by a corrupt Zoltan official had cost her her command when she failed to pay the expected bribe. She'd had 20 of her fellow Themercan under her command, then plying the trade routes of the council wells and making a tidy profit in the process. I still don't understand what I saw in Sora that day in the bar, when he walked in and interrupted my attempts to drown my troubles. But I'm glad I listened to him. Life with him has been interesting, out here on the rim. We may be mere merchants trading in high-value cargo, but we seem to get the opportunity to tangle with the Zoltans far more often than chance would dictate. You'd think he'd confide in me, his first officer, minus how he manages to always goad them into finding and attacking us. The door to the captain's cabin opened, and she went inside. Sora stood as she entered, grabbed a bottle off the wall, and peeled off the wax seal. Jago did a double take. The captain hadn't pulled down a bottle, he'd pulled down the bottle. The bottle of red label whiskey which, the man always claimed, had cost enough to buy him a homestead. Sora raised her eyebrows as she accepted the glass, letting her gaze ask the questions for her. Sora's grin widened further. Sorry to summon you here and then keep you waiting, but the shipyard called and I had to take it. Jago cocked her head to the side. Shipyard? We aren't due for maintenance for... Sora gestured with his hand.
Oh, we aren't going in for maintenance. We are going in for a refit, courtesy of the Confederation.
Sora then handed her a datapad which displayed a very official-looking document bearing the seals for both the Confederation Assembly and the Confederation military. The human then raised a glass.
Here is to our new future, and the chance to finally go out and kick some serious salt and ass.
Glasses clinked together and Jago gulped the whiskey down. It burned, but somehow felt exhilarating at the same time. Sora stood there with a slightly bemused look on his face. Apparently the human had expected her to react more soundly to what she'd seen. She took a moment to skim the document, then looked back at the title, figuring that was as good a place as any to start asking questions. She looked her captain in the eyes and up.
What is a letter of marque?
Admiral Thalnare Skook sat on his flag bridge and impatiently tapped a single claw in time with the clock, counting down the last slices of time until he walked into history. He had been given the honor of securing the first Zoltan victory in the exterminators of the hairless simians, an honor sure to lead to voting rights for himself and his progeny. A display of the human shipyard he'd been sent to destroy hung in the hollow emitters of his bridge display. He considered replacing the live feed image, a few hours old at their current distance of his closest scouts, with the much higher resolution images taken by their recent microprobes, but decided against it. The software predictions of their ship's movements isn't perfect, but it is good enough to start designating targets. He took another look at the countdown timer, hit a button to mark the time, and started crafting maneuvers for his fleet. A tuneless whistle escaped his teeth as he worked, carefully orchestrating the moves of his fleet and putting in a few contingencies where the software had flagged a projection with a high possibility of deviation. He finished the task, pushed the button to mark the time again, and looked at the time elapse. Nearly 12 orders per minute. That will be one for the history books. Some might call such speed foolish, but when I trounce these mongrels with an order score like that, he closed his eyes a moment and allowed himself to visualize the jealous looks of his peers. Still, finishing that quickly puts me too far out from when that damned timer reaches 0. He zoomed the plot out, ran a few more calculations, and considered the results. Time for the fleet to power up their engines, time to finish getting everyone in position, time to destination, and time to actually convert back to sublight speed. He finished the math, consulted the clock, and let a feral grin spread across his face. We will penetrate the space of the star system before the appointed time, but we won't start firing until the requisite 3 days have passed. That idiot human will learn the folly of challenging the might of the Dalton. He looked down from the plot and hit a button on his console.
All ships, you have your orders and battle plan. Move your ships into jump formation and start your FTL drives. We depart for our target in exactly 1 hour.
The captain of his ship looked back at him in astonishment. The man looked at him, looked pointedly at the countdown timer, looked back at him, and opened his mouth to speak. Elimar put on his blandest, most disinterested look and stared directly at the captain who had served under him for several years now. He could see the captain reconsider his words and decide that he should simply follow orders this time. Good. There is a time and a place for questions, and I'm glad this captain has learned that. The Admiral hit the controls for the plot again, and used it to take in the real-time movements of his fleet as they maneuvered into the final formation they'd need to come out of FTL ready to take on their initial targets. As the last ships began to slide into place, the largest of his capital ships began to fire up their drives. Somewhere at the edge of his fleet, a tiny icon appeared, for just an instant, then vanished. His lips compressed into a thin line as he leaned forward and zoomed in on the offending region of space. Just before he got the chance to ask questions, one of his underlings spoke up.
Sir, we detected a small rogue energy spike at the edge of the fleet. I am still working on analysis, but it is consistent with the power spike of a quantum entanglement communicator booting up.
The Admiral stomped a foot to silence the woman, slapped a control for a fleet-wide channel, and bellowed.
All ships, green alert. Full power to shields and weapons, prepare for attack.
Klaxons sounded, and the massive blast doors which protected his bridge began to slide into place. He leaned back himself and strapped into his chair, and noted with approval that his bridge crew had done the same. Icons on the various ships in his fleet changed as they shifted their power reserves to weapons instead of preparing to create the miniature singularities which would give them FTL speeds. He sat forward against his restraints, willing those weapons to power up faster. I responded as quickly as I possibly could, on minimal evidence at best. No one could have done any better, no one could expect. His response, and the responsiveness of his people, did them no good, however. Another set of alerts sounded throughout the flag bridge as dozens of human ships transitioned from FTL to normal space speeds. All of the ships had their weapons fully powered. They were waiting for us. Somewhere just outside of our sensor range, weapons and FTL drives already fully powered. Normal military doctrine is to keep weapons off until after forming the singularity to charge weapons. Maintaining a singularity is not nearly as power-heavy as forming one, but a situation like this warrants a different strategy. Well played, humans. Well played. His subordinates chattered at high speed into their headsets and slammed their fingers into their controls with the speed born of fear and nerves. They have fewer ships than we do, but they caught us with our tails in the mud and will be able to destroy us before we can get off a single shot. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and waited for the end.